Keep in mind, making tallow is simple. All you're doing is melting down the fats and then straining it and pouring it into jars. Hey my friends, today I'm going to show you how to make your own beef tallow. This is the easiest way to do it. It's called the dry method. I've tried several different ways of making beef tallow and have figured out the easiest and the best way to do it. So all you're going to need is some grass-fed, what's called beef suet. Suet is the fat that comes from around the organs on the cow, and it's going to be the most nutritious and the best type of beef fat to use for rendering the tallow. You will also need something to render your tallow with. I prefer to use a Dutch oven. I will link this below, but you can also use a crock pot, or you can use just a big stainless steel pot on the stove top. You'll need a fine mesh strainer and some glass jars to store the tallow in. Also, if you're wondering how to find beef suet, usually you can just ask your local farmer for beef suet and they'll know exactly what you're talking about and be able to get some for you. If you don't have a good local source for grass-fed beef, then I would definitely recommend White Oak Pastures or Northstar Bison. I will put a link to their farm shops down below. All right, let's get started. It's best to use partially frozen beef suet. This just makes it easier to chop. So just get out a cutting board and a sharp knife and start chopping up your beef suet into small to medium-sized chunks like this. If you have a meat grinder, you can use that to grind up your suet, which will make it render really easily, but the actual grinding process I've found is really difficult. Maybe I just don't have a very good grinder, but if you could get your butcher to grind up the suet for you, that would make the whole process super easy. My grinder was not cooperating very well, and so I ended up just kind of taking the blade out and having it crush the suet, which will be good enough to use to render. From now on, I plan to skip the grinder and just chop up the suet into chunks, and once it melts down enough, I'll use an immersion blender on the suet, and that will save a lot of time and mess. So the first time I tried the dry rendering method, I used the smallest burner on the lowest setting on my stovetop, and it still burned. And what I realized is that my stovetop is just too hot, and so I got one of these, I guess it's a heat deflector or something like that, and it fits right on here, and then I put the Dutch oven on top, and that makes it so it doesn't burn. Okay, so I'm just gonna turn this on low, and as you can see, I've got this heat deflector here to raise it up to make it so it's not too hot to burn. A lot of stovetops already you'll be good to just do it on the lowest burner and the lowest setting, but if you do happen to notice your tallow is burning, then your stovetop just might be too hot. Make sure to keep the lid off of the Dutch oven or crock pot or stock pot that you're using to render your tallow with. If you put the lid on, then the moisture will stay in, and that's what will cause the tallow to go rancid. You want to make sure all the moisture comes off the tallow, so just keep the lid off. That'll help it to not burn as well, and just keep an eye on it to make sure it doesn't burn. Most stovetops, the smallest burner with the lowest setting will be perfect for rendering tallow, but in some cases, like in mine, the gas stovetop that we have is just too powerful and it's too hot to get that low simmer, and so it causes the tallow to be more prone to burning. So just keep an eye on it and adjust as needed. The suet will start to slowly melt down like this. I like to give it a little bit of a stir every 30 minutes or 45 minutes or so, just to make sure that there aren't any bits getting burned on the bottom. Someone on Instagram actually recommended I use an immersion blender on the tallow. Once the chunks melt down enough to where they're soft, you can use an immersion blender, and it'll blend it up really fine so that the tallow will render more quickly, and this way there will be less waste as well. After a few hours, the tallow should be done rendering, and you can use these fine mesh strainers to strain the impurities out of the tallow into a glass jar. I like to put it into one of these pourable measuring cups, and so I can pour it into the jars more easily. I found that some people really overcomplicate making tallow. It's literally just melting down fat. Then I pour the tallow into mason jars. I used about 4 or 5 pounds of suet and ended up with 5 cups of tallow. After the leftover pieces I strained out cooled a little bit, I put them into a cheesecloth and was able to squeeze out another whole cup of tallow. So this is a really good way to make sure you get all of the tallow you can out of your suet. So after you finish pouring the tallow into jars, then you can either put it in the fridge or you can leave it just sitting out, and it will turn kind of a lighter, either white or light gold color. You can store your tallow at room temperature in the fridge or in the freezer. It's totally up to you. It will last a long time, even just at room temperature, probably at least a year or longer. You'll know if it goes off, it'll smell rancid. This has never happened to me. Typically we use our tallow in plenty of time before even worrying about them going off, but if you want to keep them in the fridge, you can, and it'll last for probably 2 years, maybe even more. Tallow is an amazing fat to cook with. We use it to sear our steaks. We use it if we're going to deep fry things. We even made homemade french fries with tallow. Keep in mind, making tallow is simple. All you're doing is melting down the fats and then straining it and pouring it into jars. A lot of people will use cheesecloth when straining their tallow. I typically just use the fine mesh strainers, and that works really well. But this time, because I tried out the immersion blender, which was a really good hack that one of you guys shared with me on Instagram, because my grinder wasn't working very well, as you guys saw. The immersion blender works really well. Just chop up the tallow into medium-sized chunks, put it in there, and once it melts down enough, then use your immersion blender. And that'll make it so the tallow will render faster and you won't waste as many parts. After you render the tallow and filter out kind of like the mushy stuff in there, if you use the immersion blender, it'll be mushy. If you chop it up really fine, or if you grind it, then you might have these golden crispy, what's called tallow cracklings. You can eat those, you can feed them to the birds outside. I fed them to my chickens today and they went crazy for it. Very healthy fat for them, and that way nothing goes to waste. Another thing important to mention about tallow is it makes amazing skincare. I've been using tallow for skincare for over 2 years and love it. Personally, I don't render tallow for skincare just because it's a more complicated process. It's very possible, but I like to get my tallow lotion from Clara and Fritz. They also have chapstick and oil cleanser, lots of great tallow skincare products for really reasonable prices. So I'll link them and anything else used in this video down below, as well as some discount codes. I hope that this video was helpful for you guys. If you make tallow, let me know how it goes in the comments down below. It's been a while since I've made a YouTube video and I miss it, so make sure to subscribe and follow along, because I'm hoping in 2024 I will be making lots more YouTube videos. I'll see you guys in the next one.